So good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's public meeting for the Hurricane Creek Engineer Depot Canal Watershed. We want to thank you for joining us, as tonight the project team is prepared to share vital information as it relates to your specific watershed. And so tonight during this meeting, you will have an opportunity to submit your questions. As you see there on your screen, there's a question that says, join the podium. And so as you have questions or comments during the meeting tonight about the information that's being shared, please select that button, join the podium, and you can submit your comment or question there, and the project team is prepared to answer it. I also want to make you aware that this meeting is being recorded and it will be available within 72 hours on the Stormwater website after this meeting has been concluded. And so tonight we're joined by members of the project team from HNTB who leads this effort. And so now we're going to give it to Melissa Kennedy, who's the project manager for the Stormwater Master Plan. Melissa.
Thanks, Jonathan. So as Jonathan said, I am the project manager for the East Baton Rouge Stormwater Master Plan. And I just want to introduce our team members that we have with us tonight. We have Devin Foyle, who's going to be presenting. Devin is a certified floodplain manager, works in our planning group here at HNTB. And we also have Jeff Dowdrick. Jeff is our lead technical engineer, basically covering all of the modeling effort. We also have Stoka Brown. Stoka Brown is one of our other hydraulic engineers from CSRS. He is going to be talking about codes and ordinances tonight. And I think I hit everyone. We may have a few others joining that will be able to answer questions. So I'm going to talk about the overview of the Stormwater Master Plan. Basically, what is the point of the Stormwater Master Plan? We want to identify the flood risk and the vulnerabilities. And what does that mean? We want to know, where does it flood? How much does it flood? What's causing the flooding? And then identify what are the damages as a result of the flooding. And when we know that, then we can come up with mitigation projects to mitigate those risks of flooding. And there's various types of projects that we're looking at, and we'll get into that in a little bit later. And those projects are to help reduce the risk of flooding that is currently happening. In addition, we're going to be looking at policy solutions, and those are for the codes and ordinances mostly related to development to help reduce flooding risk in the future. So we're looking at those two basic components to develop the master plan to reduce the flood risk. In addition, I just want to point out our overall focus is from a community-wide perspective. So we may not be able to solve every individual person's flooding problem. The intent is to be able to find those mitigation policies and projects that reduce the risk of flooding to the widest possible sector of the community. It's not to say that everyone will not be impacted. Everyone will be impacted to an extent. So we just are looking forward to reducing the risk to as many people as possible. And now I'm going to turn it over to Devin, who's going to give more of an overview on the specific watershed Hurricane Creek. Devin?
Hi, Melissa. Thank you. My name is Devin Foyle, and as Melissa said, I'm a planner with HNTB. I'm just going to go over what a watershed is real quick, and then kind of go over the drainage system and some slides to really just keep in mind for the rest of the meeting. So just quickly, a watershed. What is a watershed? It is an area of land that collects all of the rainfall, and that the rainfall drains into a common outlet. So to better evaluate the flood risk and those vulnerabilities that Melissa was talking about, the Stormwater Master Plan divided the parish into 11 different watersheds. And that's what you can see on this screen right here. The red portion popping out is the Hurricane Creek watershed. And that can just kind of help you orient what we're talking about today. You can also go on our website, which has an interactive map of all the watersheds, and you can type in an address for anywhere in the parish, and it will let you know what watershed that address is in. So if we could go to the next slide. So I just want to talk a little bit about the drainage system in this watershed. This map shows that the surface drainage system and the subsurface drainage system. So the blue line segments show the overland flow channels or the surface drainage system within this watershed. And then those white dots are locations of structures that enter into the subsurface or the underground portions of the drainage system. So each one of those little white dots right there is what that denotes. And so within this watershed, the Hurricane Creek watershed, water drains towards the east into the Comey River. And so in the beginning phases of the Stormwater Master Plan, the project team underwent a pretty big effort to collect data on the drainage system. And why gather all this data? Because you can't really fix when you don't know what's wrong. So you can't really address the flood risk without knowing the extent of the flood risk. So parish-wide, the project team gathered over 350 miles of channels. They surveyed over 350 miles of channels and also inspected over 60,000 of those subsurface structures, those little white dots that I was talking about. Excuse me. Also, more than 800 bridges and culverts were inspected as well. And so then that data was put into the models to help evaluate how this drainage system reacts to different rain events. And Melissa and Jeff are going to go over that a little more in detail in the coming minutes here. So this map right here, this is showing a LiDAR map. LiDAR just stands for light detection and ranging. Basically, it's technology that uses a laser to scan the surface of the land to better understand the elevations of the land. So the red colors are higher elevations and the green colors are lower elevations. So in the Hurricane Creek watershed, the western areas are generally higher elevations, as you can see there in that northwestern area. And then once you move towards the east and down towards the channels, portions of the watershed, the land gets lower into those green colors, And this helps explain why the water drains to the Comey River in the east, right? And so, like I said, the channels and the canals are very low elevations there. So if you notice really those green colors, low areas surrounding the Roberts Canal and then Hurricane Creek, those are the lowest, those are very, very low elevations. And if you kind of notice how Hurricane Creek stretches out into the west over there, it kind of reaches past that watershed into the Montesino Bayou area. And so those lower elevations, that's going to be very important to note when Jeff and Melissa start going more into detail into the models. Even though it's generally higher elevations there, it is important to note that. But keep those elevations in mind while we're looking at this, the FEMA Special Flood Hazard Area Map. So the teal areas, the blue teal areas are flood zones designated by FEMA to flood in the 100-year event. And what does 100-year exactly mean? It does not mean flood every 100 years. It means that there's a 1% chance in any given year that these areas are going to flood. And if you remember back to that LiDAR map that we were just looking at with the reds as the highs and the greens as the lows, all those green areas were in those, gathered around the channels and the creeks. Well, the floodplain areas here kind of match that topography of the lower elevations. So the flood zones are gathered around the eastern portions where the Comey River is, as well as around, Hurricane Creek and Roberts Canal there. And if you look all the way back to the west again, that floodplain still extends into that Montesino area. And it is important, and like I said, Jeff and Melissa will go over that in more detail, but it is important to note that the gray areas, the grayish areas within the blue areas are developed areas within the floodplain. So those are just kind of areas at higher risk, those developed areas. And if we could go to the next slide. So this map shows an amalgamation, just a conglomeration of data that we have of issues with flooding. So the stars represent 3 different things: photos and emails submitted by parish residents, 311, 311 drainage complaint calls, and repetitive and severe repetitive loss areas. And this map just kind of ties together kind of what we've been seeing with the elevations and with the drainage map and with the FEMA flood map. Many of these drainage and flooding concerns are really clustered around the streams and channels, which are those lower elevations and which are those floodplains. So everything that was colored green in that LiDAR map, that dark green, those low elevations, anything clustered around that, anything clustered around those teal areas that were in those floodplain maps and those flood zone maps, those are just areas of higher flood risk. And so this map really correlates with those maps very well. And all of these things are really good to keep in mind through the rest of this presentation. And I'm going to hand it back over to Melissa. Melissa, I believe you're on.
Yep. Thanks, Devin. I'm going to talk about our modeling approach. And as Devin said, all those other things that we talked about, the elevation, the LiDAR, the data collected is all input into these models that we develop. And we have what we call a tiered modeling approach. We have actually 3 levels of modeling that have been conducted for this watershed and all the watersheds. One is what we call a tier 1 regional model. It's a much lower resolution, covers a wider, larger area of the parish and actually beyond. And that one is used for evaluating the longer duration, larger storm events. So it's a higher level model planning type tool that we utilize. The second one is what we call our watershed or neighborhood resolution model. And what you're seeing here in this map is actually the clay cut watershed boundary outlined in black. And we have a model of that one. We have one of each of the watersheds that we're talking about today. And again, that model has more detail into it and it can be used for planning and design. The third level we call what we call a street level resolution model. It's got a lot more detail and it actually depicts the subsurface system. So there are many of these separate little models within each of the watersheds. I don't show them because there's too many to show, but that also can be used for planning and design. So what you're seeing here is the regional model extents in relation to the Baton Rouge Parish. The Baton Rouge Parish is outlined in the line green, and what you see outlined in red is the regional model limits that we developed. So there's one big, huge model that covers that entire area, and then we have the separate watershed level models for each of those green areas. And then again, we have that third level that's even more detailed. And I want to show you on this slide kind of what we're talking about when we talk about the detail and resolution of those models. On the left-hand side, you see that tier 1 that shows this grid spacing. That is the spacing we utilize in the model to depict the surface. And it includes only the major structures in streams. And again, it's for major stream level mapping, higher level evaluation, and for those larger events. And those larger events such as like August of 2016, the May 2021 event, etc. Again, the middle one shows the tier 2 model. You can see that it's a smaller grid. It's getting into a little bit more resolution. And that model includes a lot more structures, a lot more detail. And that one we use to evaluate usually 24-hour storms and various rain events in that duration. The third one is what we call the tier 3. Again, this is a much smaller area model, and we have a bunch of these, and what you can see in this one is the actual subsurface system defined in this model, and that way we can evaluate on a much smaller area like the street level. So this is a very detailed model. So those, and on the tier 3 model, we're usually are evaluating the 6-hour duration storm, various rain depths. So I want to turn it over to Jeff Dowdrick. He's going to talk about the actual details of the model. So Jeff?
Thank you, Melissa. So now that we've collected all this data and done all this modeling, what is it that we're trying to get out of this modeling? And so on the right hand side of the screen here, I think Melissa's going to kind of show a simulation of the roughly 100-year event. It's about 13 inches of rain in 24 hours. So this is a simulation of the model. But what we're trying to find from these models are how does water flow through the system? So how does it flow through the channels? How does it flow through the overbanks, which are the areas just outside of the channels? What are the flood extents when we have these events, and what is the depth of inundation for those extents? And then what comes out of that is how much damage can occur. So if we know what the depth of flooding is, we know what the extent of flooding is, we can kind of tell if a home or a business might be flooded. So what's the depth of flooding within the home? Is it 1 foot? Is it 2 foot? And from that, we can start to evaluate what types of solutions we might propose here to fix those problem areas. So this is what you see here with the stars are some preliminary locations where we're looking at doing some projects. And what I want to do here is just take you and zoom in on these 3 yellow boxes that you see on the screen. And we'll kind of give you some examples of the projects that we're looking at doing. So we won't go through all those stars, but we'll just go through those three stars there. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. So this is the Glen Oaks area of Hurricane Creek. And so this is really kind of near, the middle school there is called Glen Oaks Magnet High School, I'm sorry. And so the one thing that this is Roberts Canal that you see running from kind of north, and then it heads east and then into the south. This is Roberts Canal, and as it cuts through the system, when this canal was installed, that where it turns to the east, that kind of has to cut through high ground. And so when there's a bigger storm event, that water exits the channel, and in this case, it goes down Glen Oaks Drive there, and through Glen Oaks Drive, and then down to the east towards Maplewood Park there on the southeast side, and that's where it re-enters into Roberts Canal. So that happens, and this is about a 13 inches of rain in 24 hours, similar to maybe what we saw in the May event, kind of farther to the south. So these are possible amounts of rain. And what we're looking at here in terms of proposed projects is some potential widening of the channel along Robert Canal to help push more water through the canal. We're looking at maybe some berms along the canal to help prevent some of that water from spilling out into down Glen Oaks. We're also looking at some things like maybe installing a box culvert system that runs under Glen Oaks Drive that would then connect farther downstream, kind of like a bypass a little bit for that. So those are just some ideas that we've got out there. And I think, one of the things we're trying to get out of this is just some public input here on these specific locations, and is this something that's being seen? And so that's the project that we're looking at in this area. Next slide. So this is the Park Forest. This is over near Park Forest Middle School, just south of Greenwell Springs Road. And in this specific area, we have an enclosed drainage system that we think might be undersized for the amount of rain that comes to the area there. So the lines that you see, the different color of lines you see there, depict the enclosed drainage system or the pipe system that runs down the roads. And where you see Westerly and Platte Drive kind of come together there, we think that the system might be slightly undersized there, and it's ponding water up in the street at the intersection of Westerly and Canyon and Platte Drive there. And it doesn't appear to be flooding homes in the very frequent events. We're showing that the system is surcharging, which means it's building water up to almost the surface about once a year. And that's about a 3.5-inch rainfall event or so. And that seems to be surcharging the system, but it doesn't necessarily flood the homes there until we get closer to the 8 to 13 inches of rainfall that we talked about in the other slides. So the solution that we're looking at here in this case would be to increase the size of the system, try to understand how that system works a little better, increase the size of the piping system, and maybe even provide an overland flow route potentially through in the north side of the neighborhood there, through where the businesses are, to help relieve that if for some reason the system gets surcharged in the future, it has a way to get out. So it's not just not sitting in the bowl there. So that's kind of the plan of attack for this specific area. And there are some other areas like this around Hurricane Creek. So this is just one example of this, where some of the neighborhoods have sort of a bowl area, and the pipe system is the only way for that water to drain out of that part of the neighborhood. So we're kind of considering those types of pipe systems critical infrastructure a little bit, because maybe it's more important to maintain them and make sure they're functioning properly, because that's the only way for water to get out of those parts of the neighborhood. So next slide. So this is the Monticello neighborhood. This is the very far eastern portion of Hurricane Creek in the Engineer Depot Canal area. So what we found here was that the way the neighborhood was constructed, it was kind of built up in sort of a low area. So on this map, you can kind of see the color code, the coloring there. The red is the higher ground, and it goes kind of down to orange, and then green, and then yellow would be the lowest portions of the terrain. And so the neighborhood was kind of built up there. Naturally, the water before the neighborhood would want to drain to the east and then to the south and into Jones Creek, actually. And now what happens is the neighborhood has been built there, and there's been a canal constructed that drains water to the north and into Engineer Depot Canal and out to the Comey River. And so when there's a very big event, it wants to continue in its old path. If it can't get out that path to the north, it wants to continue to the east where it did before. And unfortunately, that's through the streets and through that neighborhood. So there could be some potential risk of flooding in that area. So some of the solutions we're looking at for this type of project would be detention area on the south side of the neighborhood, and then potentially even providing a more natural route, just an open channel route on the south side of the subdivision to connect to that kind of yellow low-lying area to help reduce the risk of flooding, so that it doesn't have to squeeze through that channel to the north and into Engineer Depot Canal and out to the Comey River. So just another example there. Next slide. Okay, so what we're going to do here is show, one of the things about Hurricane Creek is that it is impacted quite a bit by the Comey River. And so when there is a very big rain event, similar to like an August 2016 event, water can back up into Hurricane Creek from the Comey River when the Comey River gets very high. Hurricane Creek, especially the main channel there, is fairly low. And so what you'll see in the simulation here, this is about a 100-year event. This is for a bigger scale rainfall. It's about 16 inches of total rainfall throughout the entire area. And it's a little bit smaller than the August 2016 event. But what it shows here is how water comes down the Comey River, and it can kind of back up into Hurricane Creek. And in some cases, it can even get high enough to where it will spill over into Monte Sano Bayou and then into the Mississippi River. So it will backflow up Hurricane Creek through there and into the Mississippi River. So it's important to note that the bigger risk at this point for Hurricane Creek, especially in those blue areas that you see, which is very similar to what we saw on that FEMA map, is the backwater from the Comey River. So just something to note, and that's where we see a lot of repetitive loss, severe repetitive loss properties along the channel there. And so we'll talk about those here in just a sec. But just to note, backwater is a major thing here. So, one of the things that is going to be a big impact for this type of event is the Comey diversion, which is going to be installed just north of this area, kind of in the Baker area. And so that will substantially reduce the flood depths in this area to where, it will remove a lot of homes from the floodplain. So I think it's important to know that we're still looking at how that project works in our models. We're going to take a look at the Comey diversion and see what those depth impacts really are. But the Corps has indicated that it will be a substantial reduction, especially in this area here. Next slide, please. So just to summarize some of the findings here, we have that Monte Sano interconnectivity there, where water can back up during backwater events, those Comey backwater events, how sensitive the Comey backwater is to Hurricane Creek, and how that occurred in 2016. I think that's something that was seen there. The Comey diversion project, as I mentioned, will help a lot with that after that gets installed. I know they're still working on that. I mentioned the areas of repetitive flooding, so the Comey diversion will help that. We're looking at other ways to help reduce the risk of flooding for some of those properties. Some of them might be relocations, but we're also looking at floodproofing those homes, or even potentially elevating those homes to help reduce their risk. Some of the other things that we found from the public data that we received were that maintenance is kind of a big issue in this area. And so we're looking at, especially in the areas where we have mixed drainage systems. So mixed drainage systems are where we have combinations of ditches and roadway culverts and enclosed systems kind of mixed together, to where there tends to be a little bit more of a maintenance issue in those areas than if you had a curb and gutter system. Now, these mixed drainage system areas are better for water quality, and they help detain water on site a little bit better. So they're better from an overall watershed perspective. They just require a little bit more maintenance in the long run. And then I also mentioned the critical infrastructure piece, identifying where we might have a bowl in a neighborhood and it only has one pipe, and that's the only way for water to get out. So we're kind of looking at some of those things as well. So this is just those stars that we saw earlier. There's 11 kind of major projects that we're looking at here. There's some other minor ones that aren't listed on this slide, but a lot of them are related to providing detention where we can to help reduce the flood risk downstream. Some relocations, elevating structures, looking at realigning some of the channels, or widening some of the channels to help provide some additional conveyance, increasing some structure sizes where we can, and those enclosed drainage systems, potentially upsizing those and helping provide better overland flow routes, so that if there is a system that doesn't quite function during a big event, where does the water end up going in the big event, and making sure it has a place to go without flooding the home. So that's kind of just a general overview. These are potential projects. We're still working on a lot of these, so this is where we like to get public input. Have we missed something? Is there anything here that we need to be considering? So we appreciate your input.
Thanks, Jeff. And yes, as Jeff said, this was just kind of our first rough pass at looking at the watersheds and seeing what's happening and trying to come up with solutions. What I want to talk about now are some of the projects and policies that have already been approved to date for the overall stormwater master plan. As Jeff talked about, there's maintenance of the existing system that is of concern, and that is actually ongoing right now with American Rescue Act funds. There's going to be more money put into that as well that's going to be used for maintenance coming up in the future. We also have a number of hazard mitigation grant program projects that have been approved by FEMA. As you see in the middle of your screen here, there's a picture. This is Ward Creek, and this is Ward Creek at Segan Lane. And I don't know if you can see it very well, but there's a constriction here right at Ward Creek and Segan Lane. Well, the project that we developed is to remove this constriction, make the channel more consistent going downstream, and that has a big impact on lowering water surface elevations. We also have a number of Louisiana Watershed Initiative projects that have been approved, 3 of them to be exact. And on the lower right-hand corner, you can see this is Bayou de Planche floodplain, and this project is for preservation of that floodplain. We're going to talk about the low impact development policies that have been implemented and future of what we're going to be looking at. I'm going to have Stoka talk about that. And again, the parish is currently working on some of the home buyouts for some of those repetitive and severe repetitive loss homes. To date, there's been about $96 million approved. It's all 100% federal funded. So as we go along, as we look for more projects to identify, we'll also be looking at the funding sources to help pay for them. So again, maintenance has been an issue, and what you're seeing here, when we collected the data and identified the subsurface drainage system, we also inspected each of those structures. So what you're seeing here is a color-coded map of those structures based on the level of sediment within those structures. So the red structures had greater than 75% sediment, the orange 50 to 75% sediment, and the green 25 to 50% sediment. And the reason I'm showing those is those are currently on the list by the parish and slowly being addressed right now. I don't have, people always ask, well, when are they coming to my neighborhood? I don't have the actual plan or schedule, so I can't necessarily answer that, but I do know that these are on the list for getting cleaned out. And in addition to the structures, they're also cleaning out associated pipe systems as well. And just moving forward, the parish has money allocated to continue cleaning the structures and the pipes, but also to start cleaning out the channels, to clear and snag and remove debris from the channels. So that work is going to be coming soon. The other projects I talked about were the hazard mitigation grant program projects and the watershed initiative projects. And this map just gives like an overview of all of those projects. The yellow circles identify where those hazard mitigation grant projects are and what they are. There's various ones. There's bank stabilizations, there's culvert replacement, new bridges, subsurface drainage system improvements, various projects. And in addition, there's the watershed initiative projects also shown on this map. But the other thing I want to point out, as Jeff mentioned, is that there are other projects ongoing by the Corps. There's the Comeet River Diversion Project, again, that we talked about, that will have an impact specifically in Hurricane Creek. In addition, the Corps has what they call their tributaries project, in which they're doing mostly clearing and snagging, some channel improvements, and then some areas of rock riprap. And that's being done up in Central, in Blackwater Bayou and Beaver Bayou, in Jones Creek, in Jones Creek, Ward Creek, and Bayou Fountain. And I mentioned that those ones specifically that the Corps is doing, but again, the parish has committed to doing that type of work beyond what the Corps is doing. So that work is going to be happening in the near future. Now I'd like to turn it over to Stoka. He's going to talk about where we're going with the codes and ordinances regarding drainage and floodplain management and development. Stoka.
Thanks, Melissa. Good evening, Stoka Brown with CSRS. We're leading the effort on looking at changing and updates to the Unified Development Code. Some of the things that we have already implemented and the city parish has passed, or on the screen here, they were approved in 2021. Adding a requirement for a stormwater conveyance check to make sure that new development within the streams do not block flow from upstream to downstream. Looking at trying to prioritize green infrastructure and developments where the opportunity is there, and as well as just making a couple of clarifications to the code so that it's more easily understandable and enforceable. Next slide. So those were a couple of things that we were able to do in the interim while Jeff and his team were building the models that he just presented on. Now, what we want to do is try and utilize those models to get some backing with data to understand what changes to the codes needs to be done moving forward. So a couple of those things that we're going to be looking at are increases in the minimum slab elevations. We know that increasing your slab is going to reduce your risk, but how high should we go? At what is the breaking point? What is that that best elevation? As well as looking at protecting the natural floodplain. So we're going to be looking at conservation areas, buffer zones around the channels to understand the areas of channels that we need to maintain over time so as to reduce increasing flood risk into the future. Next slide. Fill requirements. So again, just trying to better understand the placement of that fill and the elevation of that fill and how that impacts the water flow, as well as drainage requirements for new development. As these models are completed, these models are an excellent tool at giving us the ability to look at the watershed as a whole in terms of the potential impacts from some of the developments on the landscape. So we'll be looking at trying to utilize these models to assess potential impacts.
Thanks, Doka. So what you're seeing here is our overall schedule and where we are today. The red line indicates where we are today. The major tasks are on the left. Our data collection is complete. You can see that we're almost complete with the modeling assessment, basically figuring out, building the models and using them to identify the flood hazards for various flood events. And then the next one's the flood risk mitigation measures. That's where we're working on right now to identify those solutions to reduce the flood risk. And again, as Stoka talked about, the codes and ordinances and looking at the various policies that we want to implement. And you can see when those are expected to be done later in 2022. And then the actual overall development of the final stormwater master plan report, as well as a 20-year capital improvement plan, which takes those identified recommended projects, prioritizes them, puts funding to them, and a schedule. And then you'll notice on the bottom, public outreach, which expands from the beginning through the end of the project. And obviously this is where you folks come in, that we want to share with you what we're doing, where we are, and get feedback from all of you. So I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan. Jonathan. Maybe. Jonathan, are you there? Well, I'll just talk about this slide until we get Jonathan back. So what you're seeing here is this is how to reach us. We have the website, as you obviously know. In order to get onto this meeting, you had to register. We also have a email that you can use to send in, ask questions. If you have concerns, etc., you can do that. We also put out information through social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We put out information regarding public meetings, fact sheets, little tidbits about what's happening. So all of these methods are ways to contact us. And I'm going to try and turn it over to Jonathan again, or Claire.
Yes, ma'am. Sorry about that. We are having a few technical issues over here. Unfortunately, Jonathan's computer froze up. So you guys can hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. Very good. Very good. All right, so this is the part of the presentation where people can submit questions, and our project team will try to get us an answer on those. So we're going to start with, there was mention of cleaning up underground drainage pipes, and someone has asked if there's a schedule for that.
I'm going to answer. I don't know if Fred wants to answer. I do not know the schedule. I know the parish has their schedule. I think their concern about releasing a specific schedule is that it will result in various people saying, well, when are you going to get to my area? Why am I not before another neighborhood? And so I think the parish is just keeping that more close hold so that to avoid getting into those types of discussions. I don't know, Fred, if you're on, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Sure, I don't have any problem doing that, Melissa, and thank you. And let me just say this, you're partly correct in regards to your statement. I think the key part that we need to look at from how we set up the original schedule as part of the $20 million under the American Rescue Act, we have $1.8 million that we allocated for actually cleaning storm drain boxes, looking at some of the pipes that were connected to those locations. And what we did was exactly what you indicated in your report, that we looked at various segments of our system that's already been inspected, and we were addressing the areas that anywhere from 25% up to 75% that had sediment in those drain boxes. We were addressing those first. Those are throughout the entire parish, and that's what we were trying to address to start. We are certainly going to have additional funds that will be coming in the next month that the mayor will be presenting to another additional American Rescue Act package. And then we will try to be a little more specific in regards to the areas that we're looking at. Everything we're doing, and I think the public needs to understand this very closely, is all has to do with what was originally done through the physical inspection that HNTB had done within our system. We have to concentrate on the areas that have the most sediment, the most problems first. And I realize everybody has their storm drain box is a problem or could be a problem. It may not be the box, it could be a pipe somewhere within the system itself, but we're going to get to them as quickly as we can. We look at the rankings also from not only from the study that was done, we look at our 311 complaints, making sure we can try to address as many as we can in an area once we're in there. And I know sometimes it's not good enough, but we're doing everything we can based on what was originally evaluated by the study that we wanted to how to address our drainage system within the parish. That's it.
Fred, just to add on to that, I know to date that there's been, I forget, I saw the stat. I know it's like over 1 million pounds of debris and sediment has been removed. I can't remember the exact number, and I don't remember exactly how many structures and segments have been looked at. I think it's over 1,500 or
Yes,
so.
that's correct. We'll probably have a little over 1,500. Originally, we proposed about 1,800 on the schedule, and unfortunately, we don't have enough funds for this plan at this point. But we're going to pick up from the new funding and try to at least address the areas that have the most settlement in it, so we can at least start getting part of this system, our drainage system, functioning like it's supposed to be. So you're right. Well, again, Melissa, on that. But I think we will try to provide a little more information in the next round so public can at least see where we are. We're removing a lot of settlement from our system. And if you don't do that, then your system's not going to work like it was originally designed to address. So that's what we're doing with our program at this point.
Well, thanks, Fred. I kind of have a follow-up question to that that someone has asked. They're asking how would they find out if their particular area, their street, was part of this schedule, this work schedule? And I would advise them to, if they have not already put in a 311 request through the app, to do that. So as in regards to you guys having an inventory of people who have submitted 311 requests, if they haven't even put a request in yet, then that's probably step one.
Claire, you're right. Number one, they need to make sure if they have a concern about the drainage system within their subdivision or within the area they're living in, particularly dealing with storm drain boxes or pipe, they need to be sure that they are on file, that they need to register with 311 what the issue is, what they perceive what the issue is, and then that will get within the system. Then we will ultimately have people to inspect what needs to be looked at. And if the work needs to be done, certainly I will tell you it will get scheduled. As to when that schedule may be, that all depends, number one, on the number. And currently, as I understand it, we have close to about almost 4,000 that we had from just storm drain issues to deal with on backlog. But we're making headway because a lot of these that we're looking at have already been filed within the system, and we are at least addressing many of those backlogs that needed to be handled. But at this point, you certainly need to put your concerns, I hate to say complaint, but your complaint within the 3-1 system. And once that's done, we're going to, with our next round, try to look at some of these areas that may have in subdivisions that have maybe 8 or 9 or 10 locations to be looked at. We will try to catch them all at the same time. Can't promise that at this point because I really don't know exactly what our numbers are at this point, but I know this, we are making headway. We are doing a lot of cleaning, and many of the areas that we have done some work in, homeowners have already called and expressed, satisfaction about it's finally doing and it's finally draining like it's supposed to.
Great, thank you so much. So our next question is, are there current projects greenlit in this area, and specifically around water storage?
I'll answer regarding projects that have already been approved. There are not in this particular watershed, except the Comey River diversion being done by the Corps. That will have an impact on this watershed. Jeff, did you want to maybe respond to what other projects are being looked at? And storage is definitely one of the items we are looking at in this watershed.
Yes, yeah, I would say we're looking at locations where we can provide detention storage where possible. And then we're also looking at floodplain preservation where it still exists, especially in the lower portions of Hurricane Creek that kind of are in that backwater of the Comey that I had kind of mentioned there. I will also mention there, Plank Road, there's a location at Plank Road where there was some erosion, and that kind of is just on the edge of the watershed, on the very west end of the watershed, Melissa. That's an HMGP project, if I remember correct. That got funding to repair the canal, Hurricane Creek there when it spills through Plank Road.
Correct.
Yep.
Melissa, I would only make a comment to that about the fact that in reality, based on the Comey diversion project, I think that when you look at it, and certainly we're going to look at other projects for this watershed area, because I think all watersheds are going to have to be looked at and evaluated, but we also don't want to be spending money, a whole lot of money, on things that we don't need to do at this point until we get the Comey diversion in place, but also to the point where it functions like it's supposed to. And based on the modeling that, and I know y'all's group has looked at this also based on what's been provided to us by the Corps and also by DOTD, it's certainly going to reduce lots of the areas in the floodplain that will have a great impact to them. And to me, that's going to be probably one of the biggest projects, I think, of the Hurricane Creek watershed area that will be a tremendous benefit just from that project. Is that the only thing we're going to do? No, I think we need to look at the detention as stated. There's some places along the Hurricane Creek that are undivided, that hadn't been developed yet. And I think there's a possibility for us to look at doing some of those along the creek area to try to help retain some of the water. Now, I know we finished the modeling, but from our standpoint of the channel of that watershed, but I think we still want to kind of get and sync with the Comey diversion and look at what that does and what other areas that we can really concentrate on to try to reduce the flood risk. And I say that, and I know Melissa's and the whole team has said this, it's not going to do away with all flooding, but it's certainly going to reduce the risk of having backwater, headwater in these areas. And I think that's a plus for our community.
Hey, Melissa, I don't know if you mentioned it earlier because I was driving and had some connectivity issues, but the Comey diversion, in my opinion, is really important for this area because in the 2016 flood, the Hurricane Creek was actually flowing backwards into the Montesano Bayou watershed and creating its own Comey diversion of sorts. So the actual Comey diversion is going to assist in that not happening again and events like that and even smaller events too. So like Fred said, it's going to have a very big impact on this watershed.
Yep, that is correct. And we are thinking that the Comey diversion, once that is in place, will prevent that backflow of Hurricane Creek up through into Montesano. So, but just to let people know, we have an older version of the hurricane or the Comey diversion project. We don't have the updated details yet. I'm trying to get that so that we can put that in the model to appropriately evaluate the impact it will have in this area. And Fred is right. We definitely want to do that. We don't want to suggest a solution that is going to be already taken care of by that project. But I do want to point out the things and areas that we showed you. A number of those are based on just the rainfall within those specific locations. So those are still areas in which you still have a flooding issue. So I just want to, clarify that there's different sources of flooding. So, okay.
Thanks, guys. Oh, I am unmuted. Okay, so our next question relates to that. They asked, what was the 24-hour rainfall amount during the May 17th event? It seemed like from Clay Cut Bayou, it receded rapidly. Was there a blockage found in the bayou, and was that cleaned up?
I'm turning this one to Jeff.
And you said clay cut. I'm assuming you meant, did you mean hurricane when you said the blockage? Okay. What I will say is that, I don't remember the total here from the May event, but farther down south, closer to where Ward Creek and Fountain kind of are in the Bayou Manchac area, there was about 13 inches of rain in 6 hours, which is a lot of rain in a very short amount of time. And I think it was closer to like 8. I think I want to say 8 or 9 inches farther up this direction in the Hurricane Creek area. So it was still quite a bit of rain in a very short amount of time. But as far as blockages and things like that, I'm not aware of those blockages unless that was indicated in our kind of the public input that we got. So
I'm wondering, Jeff, as they're talking about I don't want to know if I say blockages, but in Bayou Fountain and the fact that Bayou Fountain was incredibly slow to drain, as well as Ward Creek, because Manchac was so full, and those drain into Manchac. And because Manchac was high, it prevented the other two from draining. I don't know if that was the area that people are referring to, but Clay Cut, I don't think had that type of issue that I'm aware of.
right. We did get a lot of great information from the public, photos and emails about the descriptions of what happened during the May event. So we are using that where we can to help us kind of validate the results of the modeling to make sure that we're getting something reasonable. So.
All right. Well, thanks, Jeff. We have one last question, and I think that's about how much time we have left. So the question is, how does the recent moratorium relate to what we're doing with the Stormwater Master Plan? And does it relate?
Well, as I understand, the moratorium is a temporary ordinance, and it impacts how they do the drainage design. I mean, we will look at that and decide based on our analysis whether, it will be a good idea to make that a permanent ordinance. So I find it, when they say moratorium, we haven't really put a moratorium on development. We've just changed some of the drainage design requirements. So again, we'll be looking at that and evaluating whether we would want to implement that permanently across the parish. I don't know, Rachel, did you have anything to add on that one?
Sure, I can add on to that a little bit. This is Rachel Lambert, Director of Development. The temporary moratorium is I know it's somewhat deceiving, and most people would necessarily, like Melissa said, it may not be what we would think of a moratorium, but the definition of moratorium, legally, is different than I think what we would normally define. But it does restrict the development, and it imposes some additional higher design standards upon some of these new developments that come forth. And like Melissa said, we're going to analyze this and see if it's something that we want to incorporate permanently into our drainage design standards, and in conjunction with all of the other things that her and her team have discussed today, and in improving our development standards.
Well, thank you, Rachel. So I said last question, but if we could squeeze one more in, we did have one just come in. It's asking, when do y'all expect to have the co-meet diversion data? And I think I would like to add to that, when is the co-meet diversion expected to be completed? Because I don't think we would know we wouldn't have the effects of it until it's completed, correct? And data, or?
Correct. I need to work with the Corps to try and get their latest design plans. The project is being constructed in various phases. So there's different pieces at different phases of, I think, design and construction. So we have some of that, we just don't have all the pieces. And as far as when that's supposed to be done, I believe it's supposed to be done in 2022. I don't have the exact date. Fred might know better.
Hey, Melissa, I have some stuff too, as far as the data and the construction schedule, because we've been working diligently with the Corps and their team to assess some of that data as far as our floodplain administration and management aspects with the parish, that they're supposed to be done with construction of the Comey Diversion Canal by the end of year of 2022, and that they're actually anticipating submitting revised flood maps and with all of that data sometime around that time as well, because they anticipate having enough data at, we'll call it the 75 to 85% construction completion mark to be able to produce that information and be able to submit it so that it would be in effect at some point around then as well.
So I'm going to ask a question. So Rachel, is FEMA then going to revise the flood maps based on that? Do you know?
We are anticipating some revised flood maps. They've said next year, but honestly, it'll probably be 2023. But all the stuff that the Corps is doing for the Comey diversion will be a map revision of sorts. They have some technical term for that, but I don't want to butcher that or call it the wrong thing. But it will be, I think, incorporated into some future flood maps. I think that they really want to try to have that happen because of the impacts that it is going to have on the special flood hazard area and the base flood elevations in the parish.
Great.
All right. Well, I think that's the last question we have. Melissa, would you mind going back one slide? The contact us, great. Okay, so as Jeff mentioned, and as we've talked about throughout the presentation, is how important public feedback is. You can email us, you can send us additional comments, questions, photos to our website at stormwater.brla.gov. We also check the social media accounts, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I would also remind you, as Fred mentioned, that submitting drainage issues and maybe blockages or anything of that sort is best submitted through the 311 app. Personally, you can call 311, but the app is amazing, and you download it on your smartphone, Red Stick ready. Highly recommend it. So again, we will be checking email. If you come up with a question later tonight, please let us know. And this presentation will be on our website, stormwater.brla.gov, within 72 hours. So with that, I'd really like to thank our presenters and everyone who put this presentation together, and for all of you who attended. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Claire.